Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the FCC. I'm Florence de Changy, correspondent for Le Monde and the French National Radio, and the president of the club. Delighted to be your host today. It's the first talk of the year, so it's great. And as you may have noticed, we're trying a slightly different format in order to speed up the process and to let you be back at work in time for 2 o'clock. We'll just see. We started the lunch a little bit later than planned, but it's work in progress. And let us know your feedback. I'll just announce 2 coming up talks. Next week we're hosting the Finance Minister of Malaysia, Lim Guan Eng. It's a great honor for us to have him. We're also hoping to have Anwar Ibrahim in the coming month. Malaysia is a very interesting country to follow at the moment. And then the following week we'll have Mark O'Neill, a member and a regular speaker here at the club, talking about the Hong Kong you might not know. Mark has published a new book with Kevin Lee, photographer, about all the minorities and heritage in Hong Kong. And now to today's talk, I'm delighted to start the series of the year 2019 with such a rich and unique character as Louis Cha, who was, as you surely know, a monument in Chinese literature and a unique character in Hong Kong society, since he was the founding editor of Ming Pao Daily, the chair of the Ming Pao Group, and he also played a very important role in the future of Hong Kong by contributing, among other things, to the drafting committee of the Basic Law. He had a very personal view of things, and he was sometimes highly controversial, including on his take on democracy. So to tell us more about Louis Cha, we are delighted to host Nick Frisch, who is a media fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, and a doctoral candidate in Yale's East Asian Department. We just asked him about when his PhD will be ready, but it's the question not to ask, apparently. He's preparing a dissertation on Chinese media history. Nick has been a Fulbright Fellow in Beijing, a Blakemore Freeman Fellow in Taipei, a visiting fellow at Hong Kong University Journalism and Media Studies Center, and a research fellow at Columbia Journalism School. He has contributed reporting and commentary on many excellent magazines and newspapers, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and the New Yorker. And most relevant to today's talk, Nick conducted Cha's final interview for the New Yorker, and that was actually almost about 5 years ago. But as you may know, Mr. Cha was not entertaining a media request for a long time, and it was probably quite a privilege for Nick to talk to him. And so that was about 5 years before Cha's death on October 30 last year, when he was aged 94. Please welcome Nick Frisch. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Florence and to the wonderful team at the FCC who has worked so hard to make this possible. Hilda, Heidi, everyone from the committee, it's a privilege to be here. When Louis Cha passed away in October at the age of 94, condolences came from a remarkable range of prominent people who were fans of the Kung Fu novels he wrote under the pen name Jin Yong. We had Premier Lai, a politician in Taiwan, Xi Jinping, Jack Ma of Alibaba, who based his corporate culture on Jin Yong's novels, Jet Li, the martial artist who launched his film career playing Jin Yong characters, Hong Kong's own Margaret Hong Kong's own Regina Ip, and many, many more. It's hard to think of another figure in the contemporary culture who could attract such a wide range of fans who had so little else in common. They all found something that resonated in Jin Yong's stories, and the reasons for that are rooted in Louis Cha's own life story. His family clan, the Cha lineage, lived for generations in the prosperous river delta surrounding modern-day Shanghai, in a small town close to the famous West Lake. And this is a region that is rich in history and rich in heroes. One of the most famous heroes is Yue Fei, the heroic martyr general. In the 12th century, nomadic tribes on horseback attacked China from the north in a cataclysmic invasion that ended with the rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongol conquest of China. The imperial court fled south and settled on the shores of the West Lake, and Yue Fei, a soldier native to the north, came south with them. He urged the court to fight back against the invaders rather than appease them, and coined his personal four-character motto, "Return my rivers and mountains, return my native land," inscribed above his head in his own calligraphy there. But Yue Fei was betrayed by Qin Hui, who wanted to cut a deal with the nomad tribes and had Yue Fei executed when Qin Hui was a minister in the imperial court. And ever since, Qin Hui has been synonymous with treason. To this day, tourists who are visiting the West Lake spit on this statue of Qin Hui, and they leave offerings at this statue of the martyr general Yue Fei. And Louis Cha's family has a long history in this region, with generations of scholars and government officials who are living in this compound. As is traditional in China, the sons of educated families take the imperial civil service exam and serve the imperial throne, which Cha's ancestors did with distinction. Their service was so cherished by one emperor in the 17th century that he personally inscribed a lacquer tablet in his own hand for one of the halls in the family compound, and wrote a poetic couplet, which is hanging on either side, praising the Cha lineage as a great clan since the ancient times of the Tang and Song dynasties. But being close to the throne has its risks as well. One of Cha's ancestors offended the next emperor when he used a poetic couplet, two characters of which closely resemble the emperor's name if you take their heads off. This was interpreted by the emperor as evidence of sedition. Now that may seem like a bit of a stretch to you and me, but traditionally the Chinese do take this kind of thing rather seriously, and the offense provided a pretext to arrest Cha's ancestor, whose severed head was then displayed on a pike. Louis Cha was born in 1924, and as a child growing up, he had access to a vast family library accumulated over generations. He was immersed in classical historical texts, canons of poetry, philosophy, and statecraft, and he also read novels, many of which are essentially embroidered history, weaving fictitious characters and plots into and out of real historical events. Picaresque epics like the Water Margin, Romance of the Three Kingdoms are full of wandering kung fu knights, but also real-life kings, emperors, princes, generals. And Cha also read translated European novels like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and also Alexandre Dumas, whose Three Musketeers and Count of Monte Cristo were special favorites. Cha's education is interrupted by the Japanese invasion. His mother dies while trying to escape Japanese bombing raids. And like the Mongols before them, the Japanese troops ride their horses towards the West Lake. Cha is separated from his family and he flees towards the interior, ending up in Chiang Kai-shek's wartime capital of Chongqing, where the nationalist government is based. And for lack of other options, Cha enrolls in a sort of political military school that's run by the nationalist government. At this time, the Japanese are bombing Chongqing, and the war is going quite badly. And there's talk in the nationalist government of suing for peace, of cutting a deal with the Japanese. And Cha hears about this when his teacher in the classroom, who is a nationalist officer at the school, makes a curious remark. And he says, you know, UFA didn't really understand practical politics, but Qinhui knew how to get things done. He didn't need to say anything else. The meaning of what was being considered was quite clear. In the end, America joins the war, and the Japanese are defeated, and Louis Cha goes to Shanghai, where he starts his newspaper career at the very well-regarded Ta Kung Pao. Soon after that, he goes to Hong Kong, just as Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government is losing the civil war to Mao Zedong's communists on the mainland. And while Cha is in Hong Kong, back home in the village, after the communist victory, his father is declared a counter-revolutionary enemy of the people, and he is dragged out in front of the clan compound and executed in front of the family and the villagers. Under the circumstances, Cha decides to remain in Hong Kong and keeps working as a freelance journalist. He also writes some scripts for the film industry. On the left, there he is with a very famous actress of the time. And then in 1954, his life changes forever when the Kung Fu master Chan, a disciple of the Tibetan White Crane Kung Fu style sect, challenges Master Wu of the Taiji Chuan style sect to a charity Kung Fu battle royale in Macau. This is an epic thriller in Manila, rumble in the jungle level media spectacle. You can see the blood on Master Chan's shirt here after one of the first punches is thrown. Overnight, there is a craze for Kung Fu fiction serialized in the newspapers. And Cha tries his hand at it and is an instant success. Readers love his cinematic style, influenced by movies and the adventures of Dumas, and they love his kaleidoscopic erudition in Chinese history and literature. For his pen name, Cha takes the last character of his proper name and he splits it in two to become Jin Yong. His real breakout hit is Legend of the Condor Shooting Heroes. And the story begins on a snowy night in a small village near Cha's hometown, not far from the West Lake, a few decades after the nomad invasion from the north. Two friends, who are refugees from the north, encounter a mysterious stranger, a wandering Taoist monk, on a snowy night. And things escalate, and they end up sparring. But the stranger is able to block one of the men's distinctive spear fighting style, which is a deadly family secret passed down from his grandfather, who fought alongside the martyr general Yue Fei. With their patriotic and martial arts bona fides established, the three of them band together and resolve to fight the nomad invaders. And this sets off a plot that lasts over several generations and 3 huge novels of the Condors trilogy. Part of the story is driven by the quest for a secret military manual that is written by the martyr general before his execution and hidden in a tomb near the West Lake, which will hopefully propel the protagonists to victory. His success writing as Jin Yong positions Louis Cha, who is still working as a journalist, to start his own newspaper, Ming Pao, in 1959. And in the very first issue, he starts serializing the Condors sequel. The newspaper business is very precarious, then as now, and so the hope is that the readers will come for the fiction and stay for the news. On the front page of Ming Pao, above the fold, it says, "We are serializing Jin Yong's martial arts fiction." And indeed, he keeps churning out hit after hit after hit after hit after hit, with a broad fan base and notably well-developed female characters, which is unusual in this genre. These novels become film and television franchises that last for decades. I believe there are 15 adaptations for the screen of the Condors trilogy. And the newspaper serials themselves often end with cliffhangers, sometimes literally, so that readers will want to buy the following day's paper and find out what happens next. Cha is a very savvy businessman, and he caters to the middlebrow market with Ming Pao Weekly, a glossy celebrity tabloid. During the Cultural Revolution, he establishes Ming Pao Monthly as a highbrow rebuke to the historical nihilism of Mao and the Red Guards. On the cover of the first issue, he very pointedly chooses this jade disc as a symbol of the continuity of ancient Chinese culture. Ming Pao Monthly is maybe a little like the London Review of Books or the New Yorker, but instead of cartoons, they have calligraphy of famous scholars and analysis of games of Go, which my Chinese friends assure me is just as entertaining. Ming Pao also develops a reputation for well-sourced political reporting from inside mainland China. This is a natural fit for the Ming Pao newsroom because it is full of refugees from the north, intellectuals who came to Hong Kong to escape the communist revolution, but have contacts and connections back home. Political reporting from China provides plenty of drama and cliffhangers of its own. Who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out. And this little advertisement reads, "How did Deng Xiaoping gain advantage in this political struggle?" And Xi Zhongxun, the father of Xi Jinping, why was he promoted and then purged? The ad goes on. If you want to find out what's happening behind the scenes of the Communist Party, you'll have to read Ming Pao Monthly. Towards the climax of the Cultural Revolution, on any given day, you might pick up Ming Pao and read about a deadly factional struggle among the Red Guards surrounding Chairman Mao. And then, if you turn to the fiction pages, you might read about a deadly factional struggle within a kung fu sect that worships an elderly reclusive master on the mysterious Peach Blossom Island. And then on another page, you might see an editorial written by Louis Cha, harshly critical of the Communist Party. And you know that this is written by him and not other staff because the headlines of his editorials are written in this elegant Song Dynasty Kaiti typeface rather than this blocky modern one. Literature often follows life. During the Cultural Revolution, dead bodies, often tied up and badly beaten, start floating down the Pearl River from Guangzhou and washing up in Hong Kong. Soon, in the fiction pages, similar bodies start bobbing off the waters around the strife-torn Peach Blossom Island. Cha's prominence as a journalist, an editorial writer, a fiction author, and a media executive earned him an influential audience among political figures. And in 1973, he travels to Taiwan, where Chiang Kai-shek and his son Chiang Ching-kuo have retreated after losing the Civil War. Chiang Kai-shek is, I think, too ill at the time, but his heir, Chiang Ching-kuo, who becomes the leader of Taiwan, meets with Cha. They discuss politics and literature. Cha serializes an account of his experience over several weeks in Ming Pao. At this time, Cha's books were not available in Taiwan, but Chiang Ching-kuo agrees to allow their distribution on one condition, and that is that the title of the condor shooting heroes must be changed to the heroes of the vast desert steppe. The story goes back to the Civil War with Mao's communists. After the Japanese defeat in 1945, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, under pressure from the US and other Allied powers, meet to negotiate a treaty, a peace agreement, toasting each other at the original FCC in Chongqing, the ancestor to where we stand today.
We have the picture downstairs.
And there's a picture downstairs. At that time, for the US ambassador and the foreign media, Mao made a big show of negotiating, but in the local Chinese press, he published a poem that caused a sensation. And it stated, in rather immodest terms, Mao's ambition to rule all of China. He wrote, "These emperors of past ages had little literary talent, and Genghis Khan only knew how to shoot condors with his bow and arrow. But for truly great men, look to our modern age." This poetic insult left a psychic scar on the Chiang family as they went on to lose the Civil War and Mao achieved his ambition. So the shooting condors in the title had to be changed before the books could be distributed in Taiwan. Louis Cha's other prominent political admirer was Deng Xiaoping, who rose to power after Mao's death. In 1981, with the lease of Hong Kong ending, coming up on the horizon, Deng invited Cha up to Beijing, and he was one of the first high-profile public figures from Hong Kong to go. When they meet, Deng claims he is a big fan of Cha's books, which are banned in China, but which he gets by special delivery from Hong Kong. And Cha later says that Deng seems like a hero from one of his novels. Soon, Deng will agree to lift the ban on Cha's novels, which will make him a literary icon in mainland China as well. And this is about the point where people who admire Cha's earlier political stances become skeptical. It's one thing to get your kung fu novels distributed, but from a journalistic perspective, it starts to look like a conflict of interest when you put the meeting on the cover of your own influential magazine and put a long record of the talk inside with maybe less critical commentary and context than would be considered appropriate for a topic of this nature. But Cha makes no apologies about the path that he's taken. He joins the Basic Law Committee, the Basic Law Drafting Committee, and stakes out a rather conservative position on democratic representation and universal suffrage. He does resign from the Basic Law Drafting Committee after the crackdown in Beijing in 1989. But in the longer term, he really makes his peace with the authorities in China. Perhaps reasoning that this is not the same Communist Party that killed his father, that there is no other credible institution to make China a strong and respected nation that properly reflects its ancient glories. That's ultimately consistent with the traditional Chinese model of a literary man who is a patriot, who wants to be of service to the imperial throne, however imperfect the emperor may be. When I went to interview Cha, I brought a pile of books with me, and he immediately picked up and started reading a book about his family lineage, of this service going back generations to the imperial throne. And like any good, well-rounded leadership, the Communist Party of today takes a healthy interest in cultural affairs. This book is a little over 10 years old, and it was put together by the Zhejiang Province Cultural Studies Guidance Committee, chaired by the General Secretary of the Zhejiang Communist Party at the time, Xi Jinping. Xi has maintained an interest in both Jin Yong's fiction and in his home province. He recently took a tour of the real-life Peach Blossom Island off the coast of Zhejiang Province, and in a statement to official state media, praised Jin Yong's novels for their evocative descriptions of the island. And one can only assume that he means that in a literal way and not as a reference to the bloody factional struggles that inflicted so much suffering on Xi's father and his family, and had a fictional echo in the sect battles on Peach Blossom Island that ended with corpses bobbing in the surrounding waters. But it does exemplify how, in the Chinese tradition, the distance between history and fiction is about as far as the distance between literature and politics, which is to say, not very far at all. One of the enduring mysteries about Jin Yong's novels is how they can be so vastly popular in East Asia and relatively unknown in the West. Last year, a new translation came out for the first Condor's book, and I would commend it to all of you. A good translation, like a good compromise, leaves everyone a little bit dissatisfied. Some readers of the originals love soaking in all the traditional culture, but if you take the time to explain all of that in translation, it becomes a real drag on the action. But if you cut out too much of the historical scaffolding, the plot starts to feel weak and wobbly, and you can't grasp the epic stakes at play. I certainly do not envy the challenges that a translator faces in trying to make Jin Yong accessible to the West, but I think that Anna Holmwood does a pretty good job of finding that balance. Now, from our point of view as journalists, with so many distinguished interpreters of China here in the room today, we can think a little bit about how, from the correspondence craft perspective, one might evoke a little bit of that richness and resonance, even in a small way, in our own work. Towards the end of my piece, I wrote, "Condors," written in the late 50s, captures the trauma of the communist takeover through the ancestral memory of nomad invasions from the north, and its characters face the same challenges as Cha's generation, deciding whether to join the new northern regime or flee to the south as a patriotic refugee, and the anguish of losing the rivers and mountains of one's ancestral land. Now that was carefully chosen. The story goes that after the Chungking peace agreement fell apart and the civil war resumed, Chiang Kai-shek and his son and heir, Chiang Ching-kuo, fled mainland China for the island of Taiwan. But they kept a few military outposts on rocky, windswept island outcroppings facing the communist mainland, where the nationalist soldiers looked out, hoping to someday return home. And on the walls of the concrete bunkers, underneath the barbed wire and the vegetation, Chiang ordered the display of these 4 characters: "Return my rivers and mountains, return my native land." And they did it not only in the words of the martyr general Yue Fei, but in his original calligraphy as well. And I think that's a testament to, in the case of China especially, the words of William Faulkner, who wrote that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That was fascinating. You can stay there if you want.
Do I sit or do I?
As you like, as you like.
I can stand.
Yes. So, yes, we're now, the floor is open to questions. So please raise your hand and introduce yourself briefly and then ask your question. Thank you. Yes, first question here.
A soft question to open. What do you make of the comparisons between Louis Cha and Tolkien? You know, that kind of comes up quite a bit. Is it just a marketing thing, or is there more to it from your point of view? Thank you.
It's not just a marketing thing. In terms of being literary icons who built enormous worlds that kept a lot of grown men busy in their basements with playing cards and imaginary role-playing games, you could say that Louis Cha and Tolkien have a lot in common. And I wrote in my piece that one way to think about Cha's world building is if Tolkien unleashed his creations into Charlemagne's Europe or the Byzantine Empire or something like that. However, I think that in some ways, without doing a disservice to Tolkien, it understates Louis Cha's influence. They both mined history, in Tolkien's case Nordic history, and in Cha's case Chinese history, to make their epics seem more resonant. But Tolkien, if Tolkien had founded The Guardian and serialized Lord of the Rings during World War II or something like that, I think that would have been a more complete metaphor for how they might have aligned. The most resonant comparison I heard was from a novelist some of you may know, Kun Chung Chan, who said that of course there was kung fu fiction before Louis Cha, and just like there was folk music before Bob Dylan. And that really captures the way that Cha was able to take a lot of traditional folk material but repackage it in a mass market, mass media setting.
Well, I have actually two questions, if I may. First, could you elaborate a little bit on his take on democracy? As you said, he was a conservative. And also explain to us why were his books forbidden in China in the first place? Thank you.
I'm sure there are people in this room who covered the 80s in Hong Kong, so I'm hesitant to go into too much detail. But the basic dispute was over the constitution of LegCo, the number of functional constituency and directly elected members, the so-called through train. Correct me if I'm getting this wrong, someone, which would allow the assembly as it was constituted before to continue after the handover. And there was a distant relative of Cha's who was also on the committee, so they came up with something called the Two Cha Plan, and it left the Democrats, the Martin Lee, Sito Hua on the committee upset. And the position that he staked out had a lot of similarities with, in terms of universal suffrage and democratic representation, with the plan that was ultimately adopted that ended with so much controversy in Hong Kong a few years ago. So many people were upset with this. University students burned copies of Ming Pao outside the front of his headquarters. And people pointed out, I think appropriately, that it was problematic to have an influential journalist and a media baron also playing this political role. I think wherever you come down on the specifics of his work on the democracy side of the Basic Law, I think you can agree that that's a legitimate criticism. His novels were banned in China as part of a long history of banning subversive novels that are believed to incite bad ideas among the common people. The Water Margin was banned in Imperial China, and his novels were seen as old and feudal and backwards and reactionary and not appropriate new socialist literature. So as part of that blanket ban, they were not allowed until the 80s.
What about the ban in Taiwan?
The ban in Taiwan had to do with the fact that Cha, when he was working at Ta Kung Pao, which Ta Kung Pao at the time was a newspaper of a great history and an independent reputation. At the time Cha started working there, it was just starting to turn into the communist mouthpiece that it remains today in any newsstand in Hong Kong. And it was considered sort of a leftist paper. And despite his experience with his father, Cha, like many intellectuals, had some associations with the more left-wing media, left-wing movie studios. And I believe that for that reason, his novels were called Gongfei Xiaoshuo, communist bandit fiction. He was in good company. I don't think that there was anything particular about his novels so much as his general affiliation that caused that ban in Taiwan.
Next question? Yes, please. Can we have the mic here, please? Oh, there is one there? I didn't see. Go ahead. I can't see you there.
Sorry, my voice is very weak. Edith Terry, a former journalist. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that interview. What was he like? And what was it like for you meeting him after studying him for so long?
It was extraordinary. We have in the room, is Chip here? Oh no, has he gone? Chip Tsao, who some of you may know, was very helpful in brokering the interview. And he was quite frail at the time. He wasn't taking media requests. I think they may have made an exception because I have a background in Chinese literature and sinology and was also writing for a major Western outlet. And Cha was always frustrated that his books didn't get more appreciation in the West. And so we had a long lunch, and even when he was healthy and strong, he was very shy. So I was told it was not unusual that he would take a book and read it and not enjoy a conversation as much. But we did a little bit of talking, and we managed to have a substantive exchange. And it was very interesting. It was interesting to meet someone who has so much resonance in the culture and to see them in person, as I imagine it would be for any major cultural figure.
Thank you. Next question, yes. Please introduce yourself as well.
Sure. I'm Ryan Manuel. I'm at Hong Kong University. A factoid first, which is the Hongwood story, the translator of you were saying about the Norse Miss. She's actually not a native English speaker. She was raised speaking Swedish. And she said that when she translated it, she had that in her head. I also have a photo for your next presentation of her sitting in Tolkien's chair, but that's another thing for another time. The question is more this idea of, you sort of seem to read the literature as political and the editorials and sort of mould them all into this quite coherent worldview, as if Cha sits there and he says, well, I want to talk about this in my novel, I want to talk about this in my editorializing, and that's problematic from a journalistic perspective. I mean, how much of it was he just needing to earn a crust? You've got to, we can sort of talk about, say, parallels like Tolkien or people like that, but when you're sitting as a Don in Oxbridge, teaching Old English to students, knocking forks over, you can have that luxury of being a bit more detached. I mean, what sort of leads you to think that this was... Do you think he had a sort of a coherent view that he was trying to explore in different ways? Do you think it's just...
That's a great question. Certainly on the internet, many Louis Cha fans have tried to decode the novels and say that this character equals this person, or this was part of the novel was being written at this time and this was what was happening in the news, so there's an exact correlation between this sect leader and Zhou Enlai or something like that. And I think that is overthinking it. On his day-to-day schedule, he's working in the newsroom, he's writing his editorials, and then he's going off and dashing off 1,000 words of kung fu fantasy and drawing probably unconsciously on these rich cultural resources that he absorbed as a child. He puts a lot of thought into his editorials, certainly. He's a very systematic and probing thinker. But I think it would be overthinking it to look for simple one-to-one correlations between the news and the fiction. And I think that's probably the reason why he was so resistant to publicly acknowledging that there was an element of political allegory. Because on the one hand, the fact that literature has an element of political allegory is so obvious in the Chinese tradition that it almost goes without saying. On the other hand, I think he was also worried that it would detract from the quality and enduring status of his fiction to say that this was a short-term, reactive, situational parody or satire, when in fact he was aiming for something that would last a little bit longer. And at the end of Xiao Jianghu, the novel that was being serialized during the Cultural Revolution, he does have an afterword where he acknowledges that, of course, these background events would have had an influence on him as he was writing. But beyond that, I think we can take him seriously as a writer on his own terms and as an editorialist on his own terms, as long as we acknowledge that the tradition that he comes out of doesn't have a lot of distance between poetry and politics and fiction.
Great, thank you very much. It's fascinating. We may have time for one more question if there is one. I can't see much.
Martin.
Yeah, okay, Martin.
Great talk. You just answered the question I was going to ask, so I have to come up with another one. And did you discuss with him the process of him changing from a critic of communism to a friend of the communist leaders?
Indirectly, I asked about it, and it didn't seem like a subject that he wanted to discuss in any great detail. I got the feeling that for someone who comes from his background and of his generation, the idea that you would be a person of great literary attainment who would try to serve your country if the opportunity arose was so obvious and natural that it shouldn't be questioned. And that coming from a Western journalistic perspective, we have the idea of the newspaper intellectual salon over here and the government over here. And so when we see a Chinese newspaper, we assume that the institutions and the people behind it are operating from the same tradition. But in fact, they're not. Now, that's not to excuse or wish away any of the facts that I talked about, but I think that is probably what he would have said and what he told people at the time. Basically, the Communist Party is not ideal, but they're not going anywhere. We need to focus on the future. And to his credit, when he was writing editorials during the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping was one of the people who he was softer on compared to other people in the Communist Party. So you can't say that he was just an opportunist for finding this connection with Deng after Deng came out on top, because there was no guarantee that that was going to happen during the Mao period.
Great. Well, I'm sorry we have to end now, but thank you so much, Nick. It was definitely as fascinating and even more than we could hope for. I look forward to hosting you again when you finished your PhD on media.
Don't hold your breath.
History. And yes, please join me in thanking Nick, and we are giving you a little tie as a member.
Thank you.